Welcome to the University of California. I'm Gary Walton, Dean of the Graduate School of Administration at the University of California, Davis. Today's program is being held on the Davis campus and is a special part of a series of programs sponsored by the Graduate School of Administration on major national issues. Today, we bring you the first of 2 hours of debate on privatization, featuring firing line host William F. Buckley Jr., Milton Friedman, and Thomas Sowell on the one side, and Mr. Albert Shanker, Paul Starr, and Bill Honig on the other. I will serve as moderator. Today's debate, featuring leading opponents and proponents of privatization, will address the broad issues of efficiency, equity, freedom of choice, and other matters of contention at the heart of the privatization debate. The resolution: we should move towards privatization, including the schools. It is now my responsibility and pleasure to introduce our opening speakers. Speaking for the resolution is Thomas Sowell, a nationally and internationally recognized scholar, formerly a professor of economics at the Los Angeles campus of the University of California, and presently a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. He's written extensively on economics, social decision-making, and on ethnic issues. He served on President Reagan's Policy Advisory Committee and is widely known for his provocative and challenging views. And our final speaker against the resolution is Bill Honig, Superintendent of Public Instruction in the state of California. Mr. Honig was elected to that position in 1982 and is the highest-ranking official in the California State elementary and secondary public school system. He serves as Executive Officer of the State Board of Education and is Director of the Department of Education. In addition, by virtue of his position, he serves on the Board of Regents of the University of California and therefore, to a degree, is my boss. Mr. Sowell?
Don't interrupt me. Thank you. I'm glad that this discussion of vouchers has gotten around to the group which has the most at stake, which is the low-income and minority community, Black, Hispanic, and other. The abysmal quality of education available in the ghettos today is one that I really don't think the worst possible private school could match. 40 years ago, I received a far better education in Harlem than the people who are living in Harlem today have available to them. I saw some recent figures showing that the difficult examination for Stuyvesant High School in New York was passed by more blacks in 1938 than in 1983. It's not a question of who is to blame for this, the parents, the students, the school. There is plenty of blame to go around. Economists deal with the allocation of scarce resources. Blame is not a scarce resource. It's not a question of whether it's the disorder or this method of teaching or that method of teaching. If there's pandemonium in the school, no method of teaching is going to work. As long as the public school system is a monopoly, they will act as other monopolies act towards their customers, with contempt. The low-income and minority communities are especially concerned also because education is their major and in most cases sole means of upward mobility. Some kids can go to school and goof off and then go to work in their father's business or in businesses owned by their father's friends or get appointments if their fathers are high government officials. Those avenues are not open to low-income people. And so if they're going to make it, in most cases, they're going to make it on the strength of the schools that are in those communities. Most of those who are supporting the existing system of schooling are people with a vested interest in that schooling. Or they are those who have a vision of how other people's lives ought to be controlled by some kind of elite, intellectual, moral, political, or whatever. Back in 1978, when there was a push for a voucher scheme, the New Republic objected, not on any of the grounds you've heard here, but on the grounds that, in their words, the least educated, the least ambitious, and the least aware would be left in the public schools. In other words, those low-income minority parents who are ambitious, who do want their kids to get ahead, are to be told that no, they must wait until every last member of that community agrees with them. I wonder if the New Republic editors are prepared to have their children held hostage until everyone in the community reaches the point of wanting the kind of education they want for their children. There's an argument that many of the low-income people simply don't have the knowledge or the drive to look out for their kids' education. I'd like to go back over 100 years to 1850. At that point, there were about 500,000 free blacks in the United States. And in most parts of the United States, North and South, blacks were not admitted into the public schools. In parts of the South, it was expressly forbidden by law for blacks to attend any school, public or private. And yet the 1850 census shows that most blacks were literate, even in the states where it was forbidden. And in fact, if you look at the urban areas, and a number of urban areas in the South, over 90% of the blacks were literate. In the early years, only private education was available to blacks, not only before the Civil War, but for a long time afterwards, as far as the high school level was concerned. The first black high school was in 1870, and very few followed thereafter. It was 1915 before there were as many black students attending public high schools as attending private high schools. One of the encouraging things that I see in some of the surveys is that the young adults are more supportive of private voucher education than the older ones. I think that there's a special role in the future for those people who have not already been conditioned to salivate at the sound of the phrase, "This will destroy the public schools." I think there are going to be repeated attempts at vouchers, and I think that eventually one of them will succeed. The argument as to the use of vouchers to help those families who already have their kids in schools and private schools really misses the point. The same argument could have been made against the GI Bill, that mostly affluent people went to college when the GI Bill was passed. That's why it was passed, to extend that benefit to other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sowell.
Well, I agree with Tom Sowell that we should give this a chance and see what the people think about it. In fact, that exact event took place in Washington, D.C. when the arguments were made about this is good for you, and the whole proposal was voted down 7-1. So I do think people know where their best interests lie and reject the idea of a voucher plan. That's what I think we're talking about here today. Of course there's some benefits from free choice. Of course the schools aren't working properly and need to get better. The real issue that's been brought up by the people who have spoken, what can we do about it? Now, we have a reform movement going on in this country. We have it in this state. We're trying to upgrade standards. We're trying to get the schools working properly. And it seems to me that to switch horses in midstream, while this reform movement still has a chance of working and is working, would be to sell it short. And all of us would pay the price for that. So my argument would be, let's let this reform movement play out. Let's see how far it can go, and not take this risky set of propositions into account until we have tried to make the schools better directly. Certain people brought up costs. Well, what they haven't said about a voucher plan is that it's going to cost between $10 and $15 billion just to get to the place where you can start having competition come into play. Because right now, parents of private or students who are attending private schools are subsidizing the system. Fair or not, they are. And so you'd have to pay those parents off first with the voucher. We're spending $145 billion for public schools. You'd need another $10 to $15 billion to pay them off. Now, that expenditure is money that could be used directly for increasing the quality of public education, for upgrading the quality of teachers, for doing better about preparing of teachers, for textbooks, for all the things that where we are short as far as funding. I will get you a better return on that $15 billion than to put it in on the hypothesis that maybe competition will help. The argument also has been that Dr. Friedman has made this argument in his book. He says, well, we won't have to put in more money. What we will do is we'll reduce by 10% the funds already going to public schools.
Is there a response to that question, Mr. Statement?
Oh, sure. It has been demonstrated that private schools can be conducted for half the cost of public schools.
Well,
if we made the public schools, the government schools, compete, if we made their income come from vouchers and they had to attract the students to do it, a 10% lower voucher would enable them to provide far better schooling than they are now providing. That you would get better quality for less cost.
That's the theory, but to get there, you have to initially cut funds for public schools by 10% on the hope that maybe down the road you get a better product. That's a tremendous risk to take with 40 million children in this country.
And I think it's a bigger risk to keep on with the disaster we have now, especially in low-income schools.
I don't think I asked you a question.
You didn't, but you're not my boss. You're his boss.
But you doubled.
There's a dilemma that's been proposed here also, and I'd like to reiterate it because it's very important. One plan for vouchers means no restrictions. Here we are with an institution that is central to this democracy, to this society. It's the way we pass down our basic values. You don't play around with that institution lightly. And what this voucher plan would do would say anybody can set up a plan, a school, and they can teach anything. No check, no determination. And so we will have, in Berkeley, California, we'll have schools teaching the Marxist-Leninist view of history. We will have Farrakeen schools. We will have schools that teach LaRouche point of view, and nobody can do anything about it. If you think that's healthy for this society and this democracy, when our founding fathers were very clear that the only way this democracy and freedom and liberty and individual choice that you like is going to survive is to transmit what the rules of the game are, a sense of freedom, a sense of how this government is organized, and what we believe in. So I think for us to choose, for us to have freedom, we are going to have to at least assure that our student body get these ideas and that our young people get these ideas. The alternative, and the answer will be, well, then we'll review them. Then you have the kind of Pentagon mentality where it takes 60,000 bureaucrats to determine what the price of a toilet seat is going to be. I don't want either situation.
Government is good when he's running it, but not when somebody else is.
Third argument, nobody's talked about the religious problem. If it's just private schools, that's one thing. If we're paying money to religious schools for sectarian types of education, that violates the Constitution. That's the reason for the Constitution. And we made a good split. And the Supreme Court, I think, about 30 years ago was right. You have a right to set up and educate your child with religious overtones. That's fine, but don't expect the public to pay for it. And in fact, the public can't pay for it because we do have that constitutional protection against that. Another point of view. What about the major problem of starting schools? All our best private schools are filled. Now, where are these poor students that Tom Sowell is talking about in the middle of the ghetto? They're going to send their kids to Choate and Andover and all these other kinds of schools. It is very difficult to start a school. I was involved in doing it. Most private businesses, new businesses, fail. And the ones that fail are going to make those kids suffer. And again, we're talking about their future, their life's possibilities, and it's not a foregone conclusion that alternative institutions can spring up with this kind of rapidity and that kind of expertise and efficiency to do the job. It's a risk. It may happen. We may want to take that risk if the schools are so bad and incapable of changing, but until somebody can show me that they're not capable of changing, that we can't do the job, then I don't think we take this kind of risk.
Gentlemen, the time for the first half hour of this debate has run out. I invite our viewing audience to look forward to the next hour of debate. The format for that hour is much more freewheeling than the last, and it promises to be very lively indeed. Thank you.
I'd like to address a question to Mr. Shanker. You spoke of the compensatory function of the public schools. Are you speaking about their hopes, or are you speaking about any reality as far as narrowing the gap between those people of low income and high income?
Oh, I'm speaking about the reality, and I think I'm very happy to have the opportunity to respond to that because your statements painted such a picture of public education with respect to poor and minorities. The fact is that if you look at almost every indicator, the percentage of minorities who were graduating from high school in 1950 and those today from 50% up to about 76%. The percentage enrolled in college, the percent going to college, the percent in different professions. Not only that, if you look at reading and math scores, 15 years ago, the average black 17-year-old who was in high school was reading at the same level as a white 9-year-old. Now, 14 years later, with a lot of assistance, the black 17-year-old is reading 4 years, that is halfway in between, is now where the white 13-year-old is. Have we eliminated the gap? No, we have narrowed it, and instead of spending money on private schools, we ought to do more of what we did over the last 15 years in helping minorities to reach equality within public education.
That's wonderful. It so happens that the private schools have raised the scores of blacks relative to whites much more so than the public schools have. How are the parents...
Was that a question? Because if you put a question mark at the end of that, I'd like to say, to respond to it, and to say that those children whose parents decide to spend money on tuition in a given neighborhood are likely to do something a little different about their child's education than those parents who don't. And that therefore, when you say that children who are in these private schools are doing better,
that's not what I
agree
said.
with you. It means that they have parents who are pushing them the way my parents pushed me, and that really helps.
That wasn't what I said, and you know it. What I said was the gap between blacks and whites has closed more in the private schools than in the public schools. And I think Coleman did a study some years ago that shows that.
Coleman's study showed that even a public school or a private school where they do the same things, they get the same results. It didn't matter whether it was public or private. Did they give homework? Did they have expectations?
Oh, I don't think there's any magic about the institutional nature. I think the magic is about competition. The public school doesn't do it then. If what you say is it's not the school.
It didn't say they didn't do it. It said it was the wrong philosophy in many schools. And you should know, you wrote about Walter Dunbar School. That was a successful school.
It was Paul Lawrence Dunbar, for the record. It was Paul Lawrence Dunbar, for the record. No, if you're saying to me that the private schools and the public schools get the same result when they do the same thing, and you're saying to me that the private schools close the gap between black and whites more, then you're saying to me that the public schools aren't doing what they should be doing. When you mention these various horrible things that are going to happen, I'm addressing this to Mr. Honig, that are going to happen if we have privatization, and that we should never resort to that until we've exhausted all forms of change in the public schools. How many thousands of years will it take to exhaust all possible changes in the public schools?
Gentlemen, let me interrupt you to tell you that the direction and flow of questions is now from the other side.
I'm up for election in 4 years. I think that's enough time to get him going.
I'd like to ask Mr. Sowell this question. I might be convinced to try a voucher experiment. I'd like to know whether this one would be acceptable to you. I don't know why the public should spend any money in sending children who are already doing very well in school from the school that they're in now, a public school, to a private school. But I might very well be interested in conducting an experiment where we take the 5% of those children now in public schools who after years of public school cannot read, cannot count, cannot speak well, do not attend regularly, and generally fight with other children in the school. And I'd like to provide them with a full scholarship to a private school system. And I'd like to know whether you'd consider an experiment where instead of taking the best students out of public schools into private schools, you would take some that we have not succeeded in reaching.
Not only am I for that, Barbara Lerner suggested that some years ago and has encountered quite a bit of opposition. So I'm glad to see that one part of the education establishment is at least open. We haven't mentioned another organization which you may have heard of, the National Education Association, which takes some very different views than those that you've expressed.
You didn't make clear that your answer was yes, you'll take it.
Oh, of course. But that's been suggested long before Mr. Shanker.
Mr. Buckley, one of the benefits is private choice, but one of the problems with choice, especially in a democracy, is that public schools and private schools have always tried to open doors for students, to give them something their families might not be able to give them on their own. And if you have a system that magnifies or accelerates the differences in this society right now, which increases those differences by allowing pure choice, by allowing marketing to individual interest, where are we going to be assured that somebody is responsible for transmitting some sense of common values, or the glue that holds us together, what this democracy is all about? How do we assure that we don't just fragment?
To tell you the truth, Mr. Honig, I see a lot of hypocrisy in the position about the public schools as publicly expressed by, for instance, representatives of the NEA. Let's take a recent example, shall we? They always say, well, religion is something that should be taken care of at home. Under the circumstances, it has no place in the classroom. Then a few weeks, months, years go by, and they say, now, of course, there's a thing called sex education. Sex education isn't being taken care of at home, so we've got to take care of it here. 60 Minutes last Sunday was full of the responsibilities of public education to teach 13-year-olds how not to become pregnant on the grounds that it wasn't being taught at home. So really, what the philosophers of public education are saying to us is, we want to teach people what we're really interested in. We're not interested in religion. We couldn't care less whether they get religion back home. But we are interested in sex education, so we'll teach them that. I say, let us remember that the parents ought to remain dominant in these matters, and that it is they who ought to be able to select those schools that transmit those values concerning which they feel most ardently.
Well, let me respond as one educator with a very definite philosophy, and that philosophy is that the schools are responsible for transmitting our basic beliefs and values in this country, and that is one, let me finish please, and that is one of our objectives, and the question is, how effectively do we do that? I will agree with you that when we say we haven't done the job in the past, but at least in a public institution, you have democratic control, you have school boards, you have people that run for office, you have people that care about something and can change that institution. There is no such guarantee in a private institution, and they don't necessarily change.
You just finished telling us that they can't teach the most important thing in respect of the vision of a lot of Americans, which is religion.
I didn't say that.
Yes, you did.
I did not.
Well, you applaud the Supreme Court.
In fact, Mr. Buckley, we have put the Bible on a reading list in California. We think that religion.
Great passages.
We think it should be studied. We think the ethical vision of a variety of groups should be studied. We think that the role of religion in the creation of this country, the biblical tradition, all of that should be studied in school.
If you're telling me that we suffer in America from the notion that there is no academic responsibility to forward values, then I welcome your reiteration of the thesis of a book I wrote 35 years ago called The Superstitions of Academic Freedom, in which I pointed out that the notion that a teacher shouldn't say that the Declaration of Independence is a superior document to Marx's manifesto, because academic freedom takes a position that no positions are finally validated, is simply incorrect. We live in a pluralist society, and people have a right to search out schools that seek to forward their values, and Mr. Sowell and I want to make this mechanically possible.
Fine, but we don't have to pay for it.
I would like to know whether you'd place any requirements on those private schools that could accept the vouchers of students. That is, would you permit a school that does not accept some children on the basis of religion? They're religious schools and they want to keep members of their own religion there.
You know, that's the old Bob Jones business. I think that if there is a sect that reads the Bible and comes to conclusions with which I disagree, I would yield to their right to interpret their religion in their own way.
That's not the question whether they interpret their religion. The question is whether, if they exclude children on the basis of the child's religious affiliation, whether you would permit a voucher to be spent in that school.
That's sort of a false question in a sense, because in many of the Catholic schools in the ghettos...
I'm not talking about those schools that do accept everybody.
Let me make a statement, and then you can deny
everybody.
it. Then you can deny it or comment. The fact is that in many Catholic schools across this country, the majority of kids attending are Protestants, and that's especially true in the ghetto areas.
But those were not the schools that... Well, all right, so you don't want to answer that question.
No, those are the majority of the private schools.
Let's go on to another question now. This country is receiving more minorities now than minorities of foreign people from various countries and parts of the world and all the other countries of the world put together because of the lack of freedom and opportunity in the rest of the world. Would you place a requirement on any of these schools receiving vouchers that they must teach the children English? Or would you allow some of those people to set up schools and maintain national minorities within the country if they wanted to?
I don't know. The question is whether or not I would make up instant policy in 30-second intervals, which doesn't strike me as the way to do
Well, if you can
policy.
privatize all of America's schools, then you ought to be able to answer that
No,
question.
not at all. No. I mean, I'm sure that there's no limit to the severity of questions you can bring up that can go on into the night.
I think the point is clear. Either you've got to be willing to set some regulations, or otherwise you're asking the public to throw a lot of money into schools that they don't want to support because they're not supporting public purposes.
That's a false issue, because every voucher that comes up for a vote will have the specific provisions in it, and people can vote on it then without worrying about what Tom Sowell said in a 30-second reply 1 April out at UC Davis.
Oh, but that's not so. The courts have very frequently said that when you have a religious school, they have no right to interfere in its operations.
I'm glad to see the courts not interfere with anything.
Thank you. We'll now continue with a statement for 6 minutes from Mr. Friedman.
I would like to use my time to try to clarify a number of specific points that have arisen in the course of this debate, in which I think the form of debate and back and forth answer has produced, I am sure, a wide level of misunderstanding. I have been picking it up as we have been going on. First, let me emphasize that those of us who want to privatize, who want to have public institutions be controlled by their customers rather than by the politicians, we all want public institutions, and I insist. The real issue is government versus private, not public versus private. Those of us who want the institutions that serve the public to be controlled by the customers are not in any way suggesting that the people who work for government institutions are lazy, inefficient, bad, or anything like that. It is not a criticism of the people. It's a criticism of the system. Someone came up to me in the intermission and said, I was a postal worker for 30 years. I worked hard. Of course he did. The individual postal workers, many of them, I won't say all of them, not true in private business either that all of them, but the great bulk of individual government employees are doing their very best to do their job. But the institutional arrangements under which they work make it impossible for them to do a good job. It's the system that's at fault, not the people. You had a dramatic example of this recently in Britain, where a government-owned trucking company, a transport company, was privatized, in this case.
Divisions. That is the reason we have had public schools, and it is an ideal worth fighting for.
Mr. Sowell, I invite you to the podium. You can question the other side, who may also interrupt you, as I understand the directions.
One of the interesting things whenever you propose change is that people say you cannot guarantee that this or that will happen. You can never guarantee that anything will happen when you change anything. And if we really follow the logic of that, we would all be living in caves today. The argument that this is all a matter, there will be no guarantee of improvement as the mix of students going to the private schools changes, ignores the fact that the parents will be monitoring all of this. And we needn't argue about and speculate as to what might happen. They will have the choice when the time comes. I see a complete evasion on the other side here of the question of incentives. It's not a question of how we're going to drain the public schools of all its students. It's a question of what is going to happen when you have competition not only across public schools, but between public and private schools. Now, if you think that the people who run
what happens when, let's say you're right, and private schools are successful, you do get some to come over, the incentives have worked, what happens to the other 60 or 70% of the students who are left in the regular schools? What guarantees do you have that the education for them
I thought we dealt with guarantees. Guarantees are incompatible
You have to
with
guarantee
freedom.
it because we have a system right now that educates 40 million children. If
Your system guarantees nothing except falling scores for years after years, which you and which
we
the
have
establishment
sacrificed this nation. And it's not something to take lightly, and guarantees are important, or at least a good chance that this is going to
A guarantee that cannot be redeemed is not important, and you have not guaranteed quality education.
We are showing that the schools can respond, and they are moving upwards, and the scores are going up.
The schools have responded only after the public's outrage can no longer be denied by invasion, by claiming that this is all
That's what a democratic society is all about. That's what a public school system can do.
That's what a private school system does as well.
We don't know that. We don't know that that's we do know the public schools can respond.
We do know that in places where people have the built-in vouchers, namely their own money, to spend for private education, that you do not see the public schools disappearing. They have not disappeared in Palo Alto. There are more public than private schools in Palo Alto because the public schools get better, and that's the whole purpose of all of these kinds of programs. I'd like to talk about something else that is utterly false, and that's the notion that these voucher schemes are somehow or other supposed to be benefits to the upper income group. The bill before Congress at this point is aimed precisely at the lower income group. It has been estimated that about 60% of the people who will benefit from this program would be minority children.
You know, how will this voucher program work? At the present time, you've got a student who is going to a public school, and if that student is Title I or Chapter 1 eligible, let's say that state and community are spending $3,500 on that child's education. In addition to that, that child might be getting additional services of $500 or $600 from the federal government. Now it's proposed that the child get that $500 or $600, and with only that $500 or $600 go out and buy an entire education.
No, it's not proposed.
Now, will you show me how that's going to be done?
The act is available from your congressman, and I'm sure if you read it, you will see
yes,
that is not what it says.
And that's exactly what it
says.
says.
A very different edition.
California, there's only $280 available per student because we have more students, and more than that, the restrictions stay, those governmental restrictions that you're all worried about, stay on the public schools. They're released from the private schools, so you don't even have to spend it for additional.
Any parent who finds out that he's worse off always has the choice. The word choice is what you keep leaving out. Let us say that this is as bad as you say it is. Let's say it's as bad as you say it is.
It is.
Yeah, then the worst that can happen is what we have now, and I agree that's pretty bad.
No, that's not true because if instead of going off in this elusive quest for some complicated scheme, we can change the Title I and Chapter 1 bill to allow for incentives, which you've asked for, so that if you do better with the student, you get to keep the money instead of losing it. You can reduce some of the bureaucratic. Let me finish. You can reduce some of the bureaucratic control and allow that money to be used at a site level and clean up the existing legislation instead of trying to jettison the whole act.
No scheme that has ever been proposed that I know of has ever said that parents will be forced to send their kids to private schools. As long as they are free to choose, if I make this point of phrase, there is no reason why, if the private school is the worst thing in the world, the kids will be any worse off because they can always stay with the system we have. So they will decide it as they see it in their own individual communities, not as you and I talk about it here this afternoon.
Except the bill sets up an unfair competition. It gives little restrictions and freedom of action.
Well, a moment ago you talked about restrictions they did have. Now you're saying that there's no
this is the
restrictions.
bill you brought up. This is what's been presented to Congress, keeps the public schools under very minute restrictions and allows money for payment to private schools for the tuition free of any restrictions. That is not a fair fight.
Now, you're arguing both ways. I've heard it this afternoon.
That's the bill.
The bill did that. I've heard that this is going to put in so many restrictions.
No.
The private schools,
This bill in Congress.
Now I hear there are no restrictions on the private schools. Therefore, it's unfair. Which way is it?
This is a bill in Congress that does exactly what I'm talking about. You said to read the bill, read it. It sets up an unfair competition. It is not a proposal to help out poor kids. It's a proposal to help out private schools and get them money for tuition.
No, because
not necessarily a bad idea,
get the
but
money,
let's be honest about it.
No, you can try that.
Look, let's not question motives, please. Don't talk about being honest about it. Everybody's being honest about it.
I am questioning the honesty of it. That bill is billed as a bill to help the poor, and what it does is it helps private schools. It's not being honest about that.
What you think it does, but let's not question other people's motives. Let's talk about the issues.
And also, let's talk about consistency. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't have it that this system has no controls on the private system, and therefore it's an unfair competition, and then turn around and say that the great danger this creates is that it has so many controls in the private system that it will destroy its autonomy.
I'd like to raise an issue which you've emphasized, and that's the declining SAT scores over a period of time. Of course, they're going up now, but let's talk about that period of decline. Do you think that the fact that the schools during that period of time discouraged students from dropping out and kept millions of youngsters who ordinarily wouldn't have been tested in school, so that when you've got more difficult youngsters, the scores aren't going to be as high?
I love it. Go ahead. What you're saying is that the mix has changed. And we've heard this for many, many years before people did studies that showed that the absolute number of kids scoring above a certain SAT level declined. And no matter how many millions you bring in at the bottom, that doesn't explain why those at the top decline.
That's it. Mr. Honig, can we take a stand? Mr. Honig, you may proceed with questions with the other side interrupting if they choose.
They wouldn't dare, would they?
They would. I believe they would.
I just want one response first before what Dr. Friedman said. I think we do disagree on one basic point. I think a society that sets up an educational system that doesn't devote attention to transmitting its basic beliefs in democracy, in freedom, in character, is a society doomed for failure. Is committing cultural suicide. I think we can see the results of that system, and our question is how best to remedy it.
And you mean that the U.S. committed cultural suicide in the first 100 years of its existence?
I don't agree with your reading of the first 100 years. If you go back and read educational history, they did have a very clear vision of what they wanted to transmit to their students. They had the McGuffey readers. It was a very
Of course, but it was the parents who transmitted.
It was the school that reinforced it. It was the school that enhanced it. And it was the school that brought up these higher ways of looking at democratic issues.
Marva Collins has McGuffey readers, for God's sakes.
What would you say?
Marva Collins has McGuffey readers. That has nothing to do with public versus private.
No, but it has to do with the function of the schools, which he's trying to say is not legitimate. Question I want to ask. If the issue is to get choice, I agree with your statement, by the way. I think we should enhance choice within the public system. I agree with that. And I think we have. And I asked Mr. Buckley, since he asked me the question, are you aware that we have magnet schools in many of our major districts, that they are open to choice, that we have free choice within public school districts right now, where you can go to any school that you want to, where we have dropout clinics that are public or private, that are funded by public funds to assist students. We have been trying to maximize choice within the system without getting into these very, very difficult, costly, and risky solutions that are being suggested right now. Why not let us go along that path and do what Dr. Friedman was suggesting, which is try and build up the choice and incentives within the public school system?
I applaud any such effort. Anybody who has visited, let alone spoken to students at the Bronx High School of Science, and knows that he's been talking to the intellectual elite of 16-year-olds. And everybody knows who has any experience in New York City that there are certain schools that are especially set up to cope with problems of problem children. I don't think I and my colleagues are suggesting that we discourage any such experimentation within the public school system. We're simply making the point that if we were to admit the private school system into that marketplace, such experimentation would proliferate and be more fruitful.
But more importantly, may I ask you a question?
No.
It is my impression that the money does not follow the student. That in fact, the state and local funds are granted to the school, and that if students have freedom of choice, they only have freedom of choice so long as the schools are willing to accept them, because if more children want to go to School A does not automatically get more money as a result with which to run it.
That is not correct. The money does follow the student. The more students you have in a particular site or a district, the more ADA you collect. So
yes.
There is that competitive.
There is some element to it. It's not the major element.
The other question I have, which I'm going to take issue with as an educator, I don't think that those of us who are responsible for the schools have tried to duck the issue of quality. And I think the question is, what is the best, most effective way of getting the system to change?
Absolutely.
Okay, now we're just talking about method.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about which method offers the most payoff and which method offers the least risk. And the question I would have is, I don't think what's being proposed, given the risk involved and given the diminishment of cost, when you talk in your book about it's going to reduce the funds available for public schools, or at least we're going to have to come up with $15 or $20 billion to pay for what's being presently subsidized, that is a huge, huge cost in this society. My question to you is, where is that money going to come from? Either we get the additional funds or we cut out existing funds for public schools and they get hurt.
Where did the money that doubled the expenditure per capita in public schools over 20 years come from? And what did it do?
Let me challenge
What we want to do is to get the most for our money.
Let me challenge
what I'm saying is that you'll get higher quality for the same total amount of money if you introduce competitive elements that have always been effective in giving people an incentive to perform better, to produce more cheaply, to provide what the customer wants.
Well, there is an incentive right now, and that is if you are on a school board, if you're an administrator, if you're a principal, and you don't deliver, and the system's run right, you don't hold your job. If that's the kind of system that's the kind of system that's possible, and that's the kind of system. Well, that's where we're going. Let me challenge a statement on double income, because I don't think that's a fair statement. What has been personal income growth over the past 20 years? What's been the per capita real personal income growth?
It's not doubled.
What is
Much less than double. I don't know the exact number.
It's fairly substantial.
Maybe 40 or 50%.
Okay.
But the money per child
okay.
in schools has doubled.
I understand that, but at least a great portion of that money has been because we're a people business, and if we don't get personal income growth above and beyond inflation, we fall further and further behind the rest of the society. So we, as teachers, or those of us in a personal enterprise, have got to share in the standard of living, and that is more a personal income statement. So a portion of what you're saying is doubling doesn't really count. It's just us keeping up with everybody else. Another portion of that is because over the past 10 years and 15 years, we have absorbed into the system a lot of children who are hard to educate. And my question is handicapped children, for example. They cost $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 to educate sometimes. My question to you is, or anybody on the panel here, who's going to guarantee that these 5 or 10% of very costly, hard to educate students are going to be accepted by the private schools and the cost factors that are incumbent upon educating those students?
Let's assume they are not. They are right where they are at this very moment. They are not worse off.
Well, but then that vitiates the cost argument that Dr. Friedman is making. One of the reasons that our costs have gone up is because we have accepted those students that are more costly to educate. And finally,
that is a very minor element of the total increase in cost.
It's 10% of our budget.
It may be 10%.
Okay,
but 10% of a doubled budget. It was 10%.
Well, wait, you're going back to
before.
double again. Remember, it's only now up 50%.
Oh, wait, you're talking about standards. That's slippery. We're talking about the cost of educating the child. We're not talking about how well the teacher's going to live.
No, wait, that's not fair at all. You cannot.
More education.
When you say it's gone up double, that's not fair, because when part of that going up means to compensate teachers and keep them equal with the rest of the population.
If AT&T doubles the phone rate, we say it as double. We don't care where the money went. We say
But
it as double.
AT&T employees. But AT&T employees did go up, and if you don't pay teachers an adequate salary,
Ronnie.
we're not going to get our quality people into the system.
Ronnie? Ladies and gentlemen, the trend towards more government involvement in the economy, which accelerated in the 1930s and has been sustained for more than half a century, has been increasingly questioned in the 1980s. The current budgetary dilemma facing the nation cries out for the exploration of policy options. Among these options is privatization. I encourage policymakers throughout the nation to review with care the 2 hours of debate just provided on privatization. The insights and recommendations of our panelists are to be valued as a resource for scholars and policymakers everywhere. On behalf of the entire Davis campus of the University of California, I thank you. I'm so pleased I didn't need to use the large gavel in front of the podium. And Mr. Buckley, we in the Graduate School of Administration are particularly proud to have had Fire and Line as the first one on one of the University of California campuses. Thank you very much, and thank you all.